All right, welcome once again, and thank you all once again for coming out today. My name is Greg Kenny. I'm the program coordinator for the Air Museum, and I get this fun job of putting together programs such as this one. We've had a lot of great ones this season, and we've got several more, and today absolutely no exception. Before we do get started with the program, however, I think it's important that we introduce some guests we have today. We've got the Palm Springs High School JAF ROTC with our colors. If you would all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. And thank you, Palm Springs High School JAF ROTC. Great job today. How about a hand for them, folks? Our speaker today, well, the Chinese had 3 curses in increasing severity. All would apply to author, pilot, and speaker today, Hoi B. Tran. May you live in interesting times. May you come to the attention of those in authority. May you find what you were looking for. Author Hoi Tran's flight through the gauntlets of all 3 Chinese curses is an enduring and compelling story of honor, valor, and personal victory through decades of war and struggle as a Vietnamese fighter pilot in an American war. Hoi Tran is here today to relive these 3 curses and explain how they applied so aptly in his life. He's here today to kind of give us the short version of his book, which we also will have for sale today, and he will be around to sign it. He'll take some questions after speaking to us, but let's get started. Hoi, will you come on out? How about a hand for our speaker today, Mr. Hoi B. Tran.
Ladies, gentlemen, good afternoon. How are we all doing today on this great spring day? Great. Well, first off, let me have a chance to thank Mr. Kenny for his kind introduction and also for the invitation so that I have the opportunity to be here today in front of this great, elegant audience to speak on a subject that is so dear to my heart. The Vietnam War. The war that the late President Richard Nixon had to say something like this, and let me quote him. And I quote, "No event in American history is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War. It was misreported then, and it is misremembered now. Rarely have so many people been so wrong about so much. Never have the consequences of the misunderstanding been so tragic." End of quote. And this is what President Nixon said in his book, titled No More Vietnams, published in 1985. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are people who want to forget, to put a closure on this controversial subject, the Vietnam War. And I'm also aware there have been thousands of books, studies, and documentaries written about Vietnam War. But one thing I'm pretty sure that you will agree with me, that it is rather rare for the general public to have an opportunity to hear it directly from a nationalist Vietnamese veteran. And today, ladies and gentlemen, this old Vietnamese veteran is right here. And I'm here to share with you my first-hand account of what happened in the long war in Vietnam from 1945 to 1975. And at this stage of my life, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now 78. But if you count Vietnamese calendar, I'm 79. And I assure you, I do not have any political agenda to pursue. In fact, at this stage of my life, I may be clear for takeoff any time on my last flight west. So therefore, my only ambition, ladies and gentlemen, is to voice the truth in an attempt to debunk all of the distortions, the biased reporting, and the lies about the Vietnam War as much as possible. To stay within the time allotted, I will probably be concise and speak on the 5 most confusing subjects about issues about the war in Vietnam. Number 1, was Ho Chi Minh a nationalist patriot who ousted the French and restored independence for Vietnam, as portrayed by some of the Western historians and writers? Number 2, was the war in Vietnam immoral, that the United States should not have gotten involved? Number 3, were the US armed forces defeated by the North Vietnamese lousy communists? 4, and what were the causes that led to the demise of the Republic of South Vietnam? And last, number 5, were people in South Vietnam happy with the North Vietnamese liberators after the so-called liberation of South Vietnam in April 1975? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with the first one. As I said, I was born in Hanoi, North Vietnam, in the mid-30s, 1935 to be exact. And just 3 months prior to my 10th birthday, the Japanese forces in Indochina staged a surprise attack and overthrew the French colonists, not Ho Chi Minh. The following day, the Japanese envoy granted Vietnam her independence, but under the Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But by and large, most Vietnamese were happy and excited. Although it was not the kind of independence they had hoped for, but at least the French colonists were out. And also they were happy in the sense that in the past, many Vietnamese patriotic groups tried very hard to expel the French, but could not do it. All failed. While the Vietnamese were enjoying the superficial independence, the United States of America dropped 2 atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan to surrender unconditionally on August 14, 1945. The capitulation of Japan created an anarchy state in Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh promptly exploited the situation, and he used his armed propaganda brigades embedded in Hanoi to seize power. On August 28th, Ho Chi Minh formally declared the country to be Democratic Republic of Vietnam, an independent nation, and proclaimed himself president and Minister of Foreign Affairs concurrently. The following week, Ho Chi Minh had his cadres convene a meeting at the Baoding Square to introduce his government and to cite the Declaration of Independence that we later on revealed that he plagiarized from the Declaration of Independence of the United States. I was a 10-year-old Vanguard youth troop. I was present, and I was singing loudly, excitedly, all of the patriotic songs in that particular historic event, because I thought that he was a national hero. And then shortly after becoming president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, he showed his true color as a loyal servant of the communists. And he became a traitor to the cause. And he followed communist doctrine overzealously. Between 1953, I was in Hanoi then, to 1956, Ho Chi Minh launched the very inhumane land reform campaign. And in that campaign, he viciously slaughtered about 60,000 to 150,000 landowners that he labeled as wicked landlords. And approximately 50,000 to 100,000 were in prison. And worse than that, he used his death squads to liquidate all of his compatriot Vietnamese political opponents, if those are not communists. And then he became worse by agreeing to sign an agreement with the French colonists to allow them to come back to Vietnam for 5 years. And then in return, France would recognize his government. At that time, he was viewed as a traitor to the cause of revolution. But then the honeymoon between the French colonists and Ho Chi Minh did not last long. In November 1946, a French ship bombarded Haiphong. It's a coastal city in North Vietnam. And this incident and many subsequent clashes between Ho Chi Minh's forces and French colonists that led to the Dien Bien Phu. Now, if Ho did not invite the French forces back, there would be no Dien Bien Phu. There would be no war. But he got the French back. So it led to the Dien Bien Phu battle. The Dien Bien Phu garrison, as probably many of you know about this, was set up by a French general, General Navarre. And his intent was to get the communist forces into a set piece battle so that they could destroy them with air power and artillery. But unfortunately, Navarre did not know that at that time, Ho Chi Minh received substantial supplies, to include military advisors and technicians to handle those AA guns. So apparently, the communists, they got more artillery than the French forces. And they even got the rocket launchers, the Stalin organs, very deadly weapons. And they numerically were outnumbered the French defenders by 5-1. As a result, on May 7th, to be exact, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell into the hands of the communist attackers. And the fall of Dien Bien Phu forced the French to sign an agreement in Geneva on July 21st, 1954, that divided Vietnam into two countries at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam remained to be under Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. south of the 17th parallel became a separate non-communist country under the government of Emperor Bao Dai, and later on by Premier and President Ngô Đình Diệm. Now, as I said before, if Ho Chi Minh had been a true patriot, he would not have gotten the French back to begin with. And he should have contended with the independence that our country, Vietnam, inherited bloodlessly at the departure of the Japanese after they surrendered the United States. And he must have known that he was very lucky to be at the right place, at the right time, to all of a sudden have become president of a country. And he should have concentrated all of his efforts. He should have committed all available resources in Vietnam at the time to rebuild the war-ravaged country and to revive the dying economy in North Vietnam. And he should have also fulfilled the slogan that my uncle, a graduate from French medical school, came back in 1941, and he practiced medical for only over a year. And by listening to all of the patriotic songs and to the attractive slogan I'm going to cite now, that he gave up his medical practice to join Ho Chi Minh. Later on, my mother told me that he returned from Dien Bien Phu and was very sorry that he was misled. He was duped. And the slogan was this: independence, freedom, happiness. Everyone wants that. So in principle, the Geneva Accords of July 1954 had afforded Vietnam her independence, but with two different political regimes, like Germany or Korea. What most Vietnamese had been longing for, at least at that point, had been achieved, that they no longer had to live under French colonist rule. And if Ho Chi Minh had not been too greedy, wanting to gobble up the South, to rent the South, then both countries, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Republic of South Vietnam, would have been living peacefully and would have been prosperous. And there would be no war. But it is unfortunate for the Vietnamese on both sides, North and South, to have an evil man like Ho Chi Minh. And with military support from the Communist China and the Soviet Union, Ho Chi Minh determined to attack and invade South Vietnam. And to stop communist expansion in Indochina at the time, the United States and the free world jumped in to help South Vietnam. And we, the Vietnamese in the South, the nationalism, could not thank you, the United States, enough for your noble gesture. So it was Ho Chi Minh who dragged Vietnam into a 30 years long war, 45 to 75. Now, was the war in Vietnam immoral, that the United States of America should not have got involved? To me, regardless of what people said and people thought in the past, my personal opinion has always been the United States of America getting involved in the war in Vietnam was just and noble. It was just because we, the United States of America, would not get involved in any conflict overseas if we had no direct or indirect national interest in it, economically, politically, or militarily. And history has shown that the US was very hesitant and careful prior to getting involved in World War I and World War II. And even when the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communists directly supported the North Koreans to invade the Republic of South Korea on June 25th, 1950, the United States of America did not intervene until the United Nations condemned the invasion as a violation of the agreement between the US and the Soviet Union to divide Korea at the 30th parallel during World War II. And then after the end of the Korean War in 1953, the two giant communist countries, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, were so eager to export communism to other nations, especially to third world countries in Southeast Asia, to incite anti-capitalism and to stir revolt under a very nice name, Liberation War. In November 1956, when attending a party at the Polish embassy in Moscow, then Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union shouted as to warn the West, something like this, I quote, "We will bury you." That's Nikita Khrushchev. And then in Latin America, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro turned Cuba into the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. While in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh began to escalate their terrorist activities and war efforts in South Vietnam with the support from the Soviet Union and the Chinese communists. On October 14, 1962, US reconnaissance plane discovered nuclear missile sites being built on the island of Cuba, only approximately 90 miles away from our shore, by the Soviet Union. So with a series of provocative acts, threatening movements by the communists at the time, it is very difficult for the United States to ignore the aggressive communist expansion at the time. So it was just, in my opinion, noble for the United States to come and help South Vietnam. At the time, there was a small nation being invaded by the communist bloc. Now, number 3, were the US Armed Forces defeated by the North Vietnamese communists in the Vietnam War? And ladies and gentlemen, my answer is a resounding no. The following facts are very difficult to deny. 1, anyone with even minimum understanding of Vietnam War would agree that through political negotiation, our negotiators, along with delegates from the Republic of South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and their lackey in the Provisional Revolution government, signed a peace accord in Paris, France, on January 27, 1973, to end the conflict politically. And then in compliance with the peace accords, the last US combat unit left South Vietnam on March 29, 1973, 2 months after the signing of the accords. Number 3, after US Armed Forces had completely left the theater, South Vietnam Armed to well-equipped, well-supplied North Vietnamese invaders for a little over 2 years after the accords were signed. But everything has a limit. Because of the lack of logistical support, the Republic of South Vietnam collapsed on April 30th, 1975. So it was the South Vietnamese that was defeated. How could the bold-faced communists in North Vietnam brag about defeating the United States militarily when there was not a single soldier, US soldier, on the battlefield of Vietnam? Now the fourth question. What were the causes that led to the demise of the Republic of South Vietnam? With the benefit of hindsight, substantiate with the classified secret documents, everyone interested in this subject could find at least some major reasons that paved the way for the catastrophe of April 75 in the Republic of South Vietnam. 1. President Johnson's limited war policy and his desultory strategy, coupled with his micromanagement of the war through what we knew at the time rules of engagement in Vietnam, detrimentally affected the outcome of the war and the destiny of South Vietnam. In March 1967, Vietnamese Premier Nguyen Cao Ky from South Vietnam had a second meeting with US President Lyndon Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in Guam. And in this meeting, Premier Ky asked President Johnson to equip the Vietnamese armed forces properly and to provide us adequate logistical support. And he, Premier Ky, would lead an invasion of North Vietnam with 100% Vietnamese forces. And in so doing, it would compel the North Vietnamese leaders to retreat their forces from the south. And that would probably shorten the war in South Vietnam. But Premier Ky's proposal was flatly denied. Cannot do it. Number 2, freedom and democracy. To me, could also be a double-edged sword that could hurt us and our cause. For example, the tyrannical regime of North Vietnam allied pretty well with the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. So therefore, they did not have a horde of hostile war reporters to sully their military. They had no freedom of assembly for their citizens to gather in large number to organize anti-war or to protest against the government. They did not have celebrity like Miss Jane Fonda or high-ranking former government officials like Mr. Ramsey Clark to smear them in enemy territory while praising the enemy. And superficially, they had no anti-war movements in Hanoi. They had no anti-war movement in Peking. And they had no anti-war movement in the Soviet Union. So under the eyes of the world, it appears that they have a just cause and they've got a united rear base to support them. 3, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, 2 major allies who generously provided military and economic support to Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. They dealt with Ho very cleverly and diplomatically in public, while the US treated their South Vietnamese allies like pawns. It was no secret that the US officials from Washington, D.C. to the US Embassy in Saigon more than often treated their Vietnamese counterparts with an imperious and arrogant attitude. The undiplomatic behavior of the US officials unknowingly gave Ho Chi Minh propaganda machine convincing reason to call the Republic of South Vietnam a puppet servant of the imperialist America, and that they must fight the American imperialists to save their motherland and to liberate the South. 4. Because of the increasing turmoil and anti-war movements in America, the US forced the Republic of South Vietnam to sign a flawed and deadly peace accords on January the 27th, 1973 to end the war in Vietnam, to get our POWs back. And less than 5 months after the signing of the accord, US Congress passed the Case Church Amendment, forbidding any further military involvement in Southeast Asia. And this was the green light for the communists to proceed with their planned invasion. In 1974, September, US Congress cut military to the Republic of South Vietnam to the bone. The South Vietnamese armed forces were fighting with ammunition and fuel on quotas, while the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union quadrupled their logistical supports to their ally North Vietnam. So the balance of power was too lopsided in favor of the North Vietnamese invaders. So it is fair to ask, would any other armed forces do any better under the conditions that faced South Vietnamese armed forces in 1975? Would any military unit fight well with broken vehicles and communications, medical system, shortages of fuel and ammunition, and because of no fuel, no air support against a well-supplied, powerful enemy? Ladies and gentlemen, you're the judge. Under the circumstance, we could not do anything. And now the last one, were people in South Vietnam happy with the North Vietnamese liberators after the so-called liberation of the South in April 1975? Well, at long last, ladies and gentlemen, the world has seen the evidence that the communist invaders from North Vietnam were very cunning and very clever. They knew how to shield the cruel bloodbath from the curiosity and from the scrutiny of the world. A network of hard labor death camps were established and camouflaged under the name re-education camps. These camps were places where the communist liberators could exact their most famished revenge against those of the former regime that they labeled lackeys of American imperialists owing a blood debt to the Vietnamese people. Another inhumane invention that the liberators from North Vietnam created following their invasion of South Vietnam was nicely called New Economic Zones. These new economic zones were hastily set up in some virgin jungles, barely tolerable living conditions with serious threat of malaria disease, in an intent to punish family members of the government of the former regime. I have personally met with many former officers of the Republic of South Vietnam Armed Forces who were incarcerated in these horrible re-education camps. And one of them happened to be my OCS classmate here in the US back in the 58. And he told me that he was locked up in a metal container of conex under the sun, where the temperature in Vietnam could easily reach 110, 115, only because he refused to sign the confession describing the type of war crimes that the prison wardens said that he, my friend, committed with the US imperialists against the people of Vietnam. And according to various reports on human rights corroborated by these former re-education camp inmates, the North Vietnamese liberators brutally forced inmates to perform hard labor, but provided them minimum amount of food and no medical care. Many inmates starved to death, and others were left to die slowly and painfully from diseases. In addition to hard labor, all inmates were forced to undergo political indoctrination classes. And while many military officers, bureaucrats, politicians, religious leaders, labor leaders, intellectuals were imprisoned in re-education camps, their family members were denied food ration card, education, job opportunity, and were forced to move to the new economic zones. They were subject to harsh physical labors, including land reclamation and agriculture work, because all of the new economic zones, according to the communists, were supposed to be self-sufficient. In reality, the new economic zones were not prepared for the huge influx of urbanized, and the living conditions were exceptionally harsh. The camps had very poor infrastructure, no tools, no seats for crops, no pumps or farm equipment, including no health services. Unprepared and unskilled at making a living in the harsh rural environment, a large number of urbanized fled Vietnam in what became known as the exodus of the boat people. There are two living stories that truly exemplify the kind of freedom and democracy in South Vietnam under the regime of the North Vietnamese liberators. The first one is from Tran. Tran was the founder of the National Liberation Front, a tool of the communists in North Vietnam in the South. And he, Mr. Tran, was a very loyal collaborator of the Vietnamese communist invaders. Following the liberation of South Vietnam in April 1975, Mr. Tran became Minister of Justice of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. But after living with the communist friends for a while, he decided to escape the country that he contributed so much to create. In his memoir, published in the United States in 1985, the title of this book, A Viet Cong Memoir, an inside account of the Vietnam War and its aftermath. And in the foreword, this is what he says in his book here. And I quote, "To my mother and father, and to my betrayed comrades who believed they were sacrificing themselves for a humane liberation of their people." End quote. And according to this author, Mr. Tran, Two of his brothers were incarcerated in re-education camps. But through connection and persistent efforts, he was able to get his younger brother out in 4 months. But his older brother was still being incarcerated somewhere in North Vietnam in a more secure camp. That at the time that he wrote this memoir in 1985, he was still unknown where he was. In the last paragraph of the foreword of his book, this illusion high-ranking member of Nationalist National Liberation Front has this to say, and I quote, "The West knows, I think, extraordinarily little about the Viet Cong. Its plan, its difficulties, especially its inner conflicts, the circumstances of war, and the great care taken to conceal its working combined to mask the revolution in secrecy. But the Viet Cong was no monolith. The motives of its members often clashed violently, and many of us who composed its political core have felt that its goals were, in the end, subverted. The human motives, the internal struggle, the bitter resolution, these are the things I have attempted to record here." End of quote. The second story is from another communist man, Mr. Bui Tin, Colonel Bui Tin to be exact. He's a more familiar and popular name in America since the early 1990s. Colonel Bui Tin joined the Communist Party in 1945 when he was 18 because his father happened to be a close fan of Ho Chi Minh. He was an army officer in the Dien Bien Phu battle. In the subsequent years, Colonel Bui became a war reporter and the deputy editor of the official party daily newspaper. And when South Vietnam fell on April 30th, 1975, Bui Tin was the highest-ranking North Vietnamese army officer who was present at the Independence Palace. And then after the illegal invasion of South Vietnam, under the deceptive patriotic slogan, "Liberation of the South," Bui Tin had the opportunity to see and witness the real living condition of the people in South Vietnam with his own eyes. And he became disillusioned. Bui Tin defected in 1989 to go to France. Since his defection, he revealed a lot of things about Ho Chi Minh. And also he critically denounced the communist regime. In his book, titled "From Enemy to Friend," Colonel Bui has this to say about South Vietnam after the so-called liberation of the North by the North. And I quote, "I was a witness to what happened in the South after April 1975. I lived in Saigon for 4 consecutive years, going Hanoi only occasionally. My mission was to organize the Southern edition of Quân đội Nhân dân, it's a military magazine, and to gather information for this newspaper while based in the South. The Southern population had just had time to reassure itself that there would be no bloodbath or people's courts set up at every street corner when a series of chilling measures was suddenly launched. The officers and government workers of the old regime, members of all political parties, and many others were ordered to report for re-education, which turned out to be imprisonment for an indefinite period. End of quote. On the 33rd anniversary of the fall of South Vietnam, known as Black April, Hu Tin openly said, again I quote, "Today I'm ready to raise my voice and let all of the people hear clearly. Our nation, Vietnam, was not liberated after April 30th, 1975, nor was it united. On April 30th, the Communist Party won, but all of the people lost, to be ruled from that point on by a one-party dictatorship. The Communist Party then implemented a policy of dominant occupation in the South, arresting millions of people and seizing properties, discarding the South National Liberation Front, and brought about the tragic scene of millions of old people fleeing the country. Is this liberation? Is this unification?" he asked. After April 30th, 1975, the Communist Party monopolized authority, not allowing freedom of assembly, the press, or elections. Is this what is called national liberation? Is this freedom? End of quote. And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I am sure the legacy of the Vietnam War will be indelible in the mind of many Americans. The pros and cons, the right or wrong of that war will always be debatable, depending on whom you talk to. But my personal opinion, the honest truth, has always been like this. Unlike some Western scholars, historians, and writers, who were either naive or ignorant to portray Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist, a patriot, a Vietnamese George Washington, an Asian Tito, when in reality Ho was a vicious, wicked, and dishonest individual. It was Ho who dragged Vietnam into the long 30-year war from the north to the south from 1945 to 1975. The United States of America never invaded Vietnam. American armed forces were in Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese in their legitimate self-defense against the North Vietnamese communist invaders. The U.S. intervention was not immoral, as the liberal mainstream media, the left-leaning elements, and the draft dodger cowards of the 60s in America tried to smear. The shameless lie, widely bragged by the propaganda machine of North Vietnam, that they had defeated the American imperialist military in the Vietnam War to liberate the South, must be rectified. And this is absolutely necessary in order to remove the unjust stain smeared on the annals of the U.S. armed forces by the communists, the leftists, and the liberal U.S. news media of the 60s and the 70s. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for your attention. And I believe now we've got a few minutes for questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Tran. Can you tell us a little bit about your actual involvement in the conflict over in Vietnam?
Well, at the age of 18, that was in 1953, I was drafted in the Nationalist Vietnamese Armed Forces. And I got a chance to choose, and I chose the Air Force. And At first, it was under the French, so I was destined to go to France for training. But then while waiting for orders, I was deployed to a French fighter squadron in Haifa. And that fighter squadron was fighting the Dien Bien Phu War. And then when Dien Bien Phu collapsed, I went to the south with a nationalist Vietnamese, and from the south I was sent to the United States for my training with the US Air Force. When I became a pilot, I returned to Vietnam. I became a flight instructor, and then I became a fighter pilot. And I was assigned to a squadron. Actually, it's a group. It's called Special Air Group. And the 83rd Special Air Group was a small air force. It has to transport fighter, helicopters, and observations trained by the US and Naval Air Commando for covert missions to strike North Vietnam. That was my group, 83rd Special Air Group. But even though we were trained to do so, the US did not give us the green light to do what we were trained to do. So only when the Gulf of Tonkin occurred, then the US, President Johnson decided to retaliate North Vietnam, and then President Johnson allowed Vietnamese Air Force to go for the bombardment in North Vietnam, but only up to the 19th parallel. Over 19th parallel was off limit to the Vietnamese Air Force. And we did not even have the authority to choose the targets. So we were to strike the targets that were designated by the Department of Defense here through the White House here. And then later on in my career, I was lucky to be one of the presidential crew to fly the South Vietnamese delegation, former Vice President Nguyễn Cao Kỳ, to Paris to attend the peace talk in Paris. So I flew many missions in many combat missions in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but more in South Vietnam. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for sharing this information today. I'd like to know what the people of South Vietnam thought about the United States after their pullout. Do they feel like resentment, lack of support, abandoned?
Sure. I will have to be fair to answer this question. There are some Vietnamese, and I don't blame them, being victims of the war. And just imagine this, ladies and gentlemen. All of a sudden, either you leave the country, or you're here, you're going to be in deep trouble with the communists. So you got to leave. So, under the circumstance, when many people had only about a day or a few hours to just get out, see? So all of a sudden, all of your life saving and houses, cars, all paid for. Not mortgages, no. In Vietnam, you either pay cash to buy it or goodbye. So all of a sudden, you have to leave everything behind, paid for, to get out of the country, just yourself with a few clothes, see. They resent the United States, some of them. But many people, myself included, I do not resent the United States. The United States had to do what the United States of America had to do. One, and here's my reasoning to my compatriots. President Nixon, President Johnson, President Ford, they are elected by the voters in America. We're talking about close to, at the time, close to 300 million people, as opposed to 17 million South Vietnamese. So if I were elected by the American people, I would have to adhere to, or I have to serve my voters. So I had to do what I had to do. But much better than the other two, Chinese and French. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese dominated Vietnam for almost 1,000 years. French almost 100 years. And at the time they left, goodbye. Not the United States. We had to move out because internally we've got a lot of problem here. And besides, correct me if I'm wrong, all of a sudden, the two major enemies of ours now are American. So our enemy, two major enemies, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, we ought to fight two of them. And all of a sudden, they split. So I think it was very smart for the United States at the time to take advantage of the split between the two giants. And on the one hand, we opened a huge market. We shook hands with the one that we were afraid of expanding to the south, the Chinese. They're now my trade partner. On the other hand, I've got the SALT I signed by the Soviet Union. At the same time, I got my POWs back. At the same time, stop the war. So I think the United States, if I were the president of the United States at the time, I think I would have done the same thing. So there are some people who resent the USA, but the majority will say, hey, the American people elected them, not us.
Yes,
Yes,
you've
sir.
done a masterful job in overall
I'm sorry.
generalization. I said you've done a masterful job overall in your illustrations and so forth, but if you could go further, what Dave asked, what kind of missions did you fly? What kind of airplanes did you fly? A little more specifically in what you did and how you did it.
Yes, sir. Well, like I said, the United States, with the limited war policy, the United States did not want some crazy Vietnamese to all of a sudden, stir up all of the big war in Southeast Asia, getting the Chinese and the Soviet Union involved. So therefore, you could see this. We were trained by the US Air Force. But then when returning to Vietnam, we were equipped with World War II airplanes, prop jobs. When I flew missions in North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Air Force, they got MiG-15, MiG-17, they've got MiG-19, MiG-21. Whatever the Soviet Union and the Chinese were flying, they got the same plane. But over here, the US flew the F-4s, the Skyhawk, the Crusaders and whatnot. We got the Skyraider, a prop job from World War II. And when I flew north, sometimes I scared the heck out of me because, if I was chased by a MiG, what the hell I'm going to do here? See? But I thought of a way to avoid that because I could slow it down. With my speed brake, slow it down to the speed that the jet would stall. See? So basically, we did not want the South Vietnamese to have free hand to fight the war the way it should have been fought. We want you to fight the war we want. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it's an American war because we did not have the authority. And I flew the Skyraider A-1 and the T-28, who was a trainer converted into a little fighter bomber carrying only 4 bombs, see, with 4 50 calibers. See. So we were very limited in terms of our power. So I flew many strike missions, interdiction missions, and close air supports. And when we decided by the United States to go north to retaliate them, and the US Air Force flew all of the jets to North Vietnam up to Hanoi, but we were only limited to south of Vinh. Even the Ham Drum bridge, the main bridge for them to supply to the south, we were forbidden to knock it down. So we were to do whatever the US said to do.
Evidently, it was very limited into what
Very,
you
yes.
could do. Is it true anything in the sense they always said we never knocked out the ice levees and so forth and so on? Was that true? And they said that would have shortened the war very quickly.
Well, we have to go back a little bit more. Back in the first Republic of Vietnam, President Ngô Dinh Diem at one time did ask President Kennedy not to send U.S. soldiers to Vietnam. Just let the South Vietnamese fight the North Vietnamese. That would avoid casualties for the U.S. armed forces. And two, we will have the just cause. It is a war between the North and the South, and the North is supported by a different philosophy, and the South is by the free world. And that way, it is much better for us to win the war against North Vietnam. But then, because of that, President Diem was down. See, so we, the U.S., wanted the South Vietnam to fight a war that we wanted it to be fought. We had no authority, not much. And especially when I was fairly close with General Nguyen Cao Ky when he became Prime Minister, my house is within walking distance to his. So, I spent a lot of time with him, like a little kitchen cabinet, and talking to him, and when he lament about this, lament about that, the Paris Peace talk. So I was lucky to know a little bit more than a regular major in the Vietnamese Air Force.
Ladies and gentlemen, how about a hand for our speaker today, Mr. Tran? Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Outstanding, thank you. We cannot thank you enough. He drove in from the city to meet us today, and he got here and the off-ramp was closed, but he came anyway. Thank you again, sir.